is just a bit of a review. You're going to be solving some equations today, some quadratic equations. Please remember, so far you have learned two ways to solve these, by factoring or by doing the quadratic formula. For both of those ways, you have to have your equation in standard form with 0 on one side. So for example, this one, I would have to add 15 to both sides. Okay, so I would get x squared plus 8x plus 15 equals 0. If I chose to solve this by factoring, okay, there are no greatest common factors here. This is a 1. 1 times 15 would go here. The 8 would go here. In order to get a positive up here, I either need 2 positives or 2 negatives, but I want a positive down there, so I know it's 2 positives. And those two numbers are 5 and 3. I do not need to do a box here because this number is just a 1, so I get x plus 5, x plus 3 is equal to 0, okay? So then it's very easy using my zero product property. I figured out that x is equal to -5 and -3. Again, this is review. That also tells me that if I were to graph this, if you look at this equation, if I were to say this is just y now, okay, that I know that this graph is opening up because that's positive. I know my y-intercept is 15. Remember, when it's in standard form, the c is always the y-intercept. And I know my x-intercepts are -5 and -3. That is where my equation is hitting the x-axis because that is where y is 0, okay? So you could solve this same exact one using the quadratic formula. If I already have it in standard form, I'm going to do -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So -b will be, let's see, let's write out our a, b, and c. A is 1, b is 8, and c is 15, okay? So I'm going to say -8, have to change the sign of that b, plus or minus b squared, so square the 8, 64, minus 4ac all over 2a. So -8 plus or minus, how many negatives are right here? Only one, so it's going to be 64 minus 4 times 1 is 4, and 4 times 15 is 60, all over 2. So -8 plus or minus 4 all over 2. And what is the square root of 4? This one's perfect one, because we already saw that over here. 2. So -8 plus 2 over 2, and -8 minus 2 over 2. So -8 plus 2 is -6 over 2, and -8 minus 2 is -10 over 2. Simplify, and I get -3, -5, which matches my answers over here. You definitely should get the same thing. What I do want to show you is an equation that does not have an x term in it, because those ones are actually simpler to solve, and you already know how to do this, but I think sometimes when we get used to solving the more complicated ones, we forget the easy ones, okay? So if I have x squared equals 25, this is also a quadratic equation. It has an x squared, but you notice there's no x term, okay? Like this one had the x squared, the x, and the constant. This one has an x squared and a constant. It has no x term. When you don't have an x term, all you have to do is get the x squared by itself and square root both sides. Okay, so for this one, the x squared's already by itself. I'm going to square root both sides, remembering that I want to have two answers here because this is quadratic. So the plus or minus answer. So x is going to equal -5 and +5, because 5 times 5 equals 25, and -5 times -5 also equals 25. Okay, if my equation looked a little different, like maybe x squared minus 36 equals 0, again, I don't have an x term, but this is quadratic. I know I want to have more than likely two answers, okay? And so for this one here, I want to get the x squared by itself. I'm going to add 36, and I'm going to get x squared equals 36. Then I'm going to square root both sides, remembering that I need both the positive and the negative answer. So x has to equal -6 and +6. Okay? One more example on that one. Okay, say this was my equation. Again, this has an x squared in it. There's no x. If there is no x, you can just get the x squared. Oh, let's change this. Let's make this 60. We want to make this a pretty one. Okay, so 4x squared minus 4 equals 60. Okay, so when there's no x term, you don't have to factor it or use the quadratic formula. You can just get the x squared by itself. So you can add 4x squared equals 64. Still want to get that x squared by itself, so I have to get rid of that 4. So x squared equals 16. And now square root it, remembering that I want the positive and negative square root of both sides. So x is going to equal negative 4 and 4. Which again, remember for all of these, this is telling me if I were to graph these equations that my x-intercepts are negative 5 and 5 for this one, negative 6 and 6 for this one, negative 4 and 4 for this one. That's where they're hitting the x-axis.